like waffles? Yeah, we like waffles. Do you like pancakes? Yeah, we like pancakes. Do you like French toast? Yeah, we like French toast. Can't wait to get enough.
Growing up in a time before smartphones, often the only way to access the internet was through a desktop computer. While I did often browse YouTube and the internet at large during the late 2000s, the opportunity for me to log on and traumatize myself was far less frequent than it is today. Luckily, I was given the chance to kickstart my addiction to mobile social media early, as in 2009, Nintendo unveiled a free application for the DSi called Flipnote Studio. The DSi is an interesting yet little talked about piece of Nintendo's history, essentially being a souped up version of the original DS that had internet capabilities, a web browser, a camera with photo editing effects, a microphone, the ability to store and edit MP3 files, an eShop, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to draw with the rainbow pen on PictoChat, a built-in way to flex on regular DS owners. On the flip side, it contained basically no original games, only receiving 5 rather pitiful exclusives. What it lacked in physical games, however, it more than made up for with its downloadable DSiWare, and the free release of Flipnote Studios on the eShop made for a huge reason to pick this version of the DS up. You know, on top of all the other features. Flipnote allowed users to create their very own digital flipbook animations, you know, like where you would draw a bunch of images on post-it notes and flip through them really fast to create an animation. Or like in Captain Underpants. Unlike lame physical flip notes where you could only share them with people in the real world, Flipnote Studios would allow you to share your creations with millions around the world, all directly through the DSi. It fostered a huge online community and ecosystem that I and many others spent countless hours watching and contributing to. But if you haven't noticed already, I've mentioned all of this in the past tense. You see, Nintendo kneecapped Flipnote at the height of its popularity, destroying and disrupting its community in a way that it's never really recovered from to this very day. At this point, it's unlikely that Flipnote will ever make a return, but as somebody who spent countless hours watching more talented people's Flipnotes, I figured the least I could do was share the story of this once thriving community and what happened to it. So join me, GregCubed, as I tell you a tale of nostalgia, lies, gaslighting, gatekeeping, and hell, maybe even some girl bossing. Who knows? We'll see. Probably not, though. This is the story of Flipnote Studios, the premier application of the DSi. Flipnote Studio was first revealed to the Western world at E3 2009. It was a relatively simple animation app, all things considered. In fact, simple might even be a bit generous. Flipnote was about as bare bones as you could get, offering the absolute minimum of what's necessary in an animation application. You could only draw in 3 or 4 different colors, depending on whether or not you count white as a color, with a small pool of different pen shapes, brush effects, and eraser sizes to work with. You were given only 2 drawing layers, with 1 color locked to each one. So essentially, you could only have 2 colors per frame on top of a white or black background. Some additional features included the ability to use lightbox frames, copy and paste elements, speed up and slow down the frame rate, and add audio using the DSi microphone. It was definitely enough to work with, but I'd hardly call it a robust animation tool. It was these limitations, however, that I believed helped Flipnote truly thrive as an application. Its simplicity allowed people who knew nothing about animation, like myself, to actually get in on the action of making Flipnotes. Yet for more experienced artists, the limitations bred innovation. Flipnote artists pulled off some pretty impressive animations given how bare bones the tools were, especially considering this was mostly being used by children. One of my favorite techniques I saw people pull off was using the brush tools to add color variety, like shades of pink and gray, or mixing blue and red together to make purple. It helped make some Flipnotes feel more expansive despite the limited color palette. In fact, a lot of the more iconic Flipnotes wielded pretty impressive animation techniques, despite the limitations. The application came pre-installed with several default Flipnotes made by the developers that were pretty rough and basic, but showed new users that you don't have to be an artist to make Flipnotes. You just need a vision. They were wrong, of course, but it's the thought that counts. These default Flipnotes also gave some lesser known tips and tricks, and since you were free to edit them, it gave you a nice starting point to test the grounds out for yourself and build off of pre-existing work. I think it's safe to say that creators were very quickly pushing the envelope of what was possible, and luckily, since Nintendo partnered with Japanese internet provider Hatena to create an online service for the application, users could watch people's creations from around the world right on their DSi's. This right here was the heart of what Flipnote was all about. Whether or not you had a DSi, I think it's safe to say that most people who grew up back then knew about Flipnote to some degree. at least through friends. That's how I first discovered it, as in the first year or so of having my DSi, I didn't have it connected to the Wi-Fi, so it wasn't until one of my neighborhood friends showed me it that I first discovered how truly magical this application really was. Immediately I was hooked, as me and my friend would spend every Saturday morning watching the popular creations of the day on Flipnote Hatena. And eventually, I just couldn't bear not having it on my own DSi, so I begged my parents to help me hook the Wi-Fi up to it. I'll do my best to try and explain what Flipnote Hatena was and why it was so iconic to those who grew up with it, but I should emphasize that it really was one of those lightning in a bottle things that you just sorta had to be there for to truly understand. Looking back, things were, if we're being generous, a bit of a time capsule, to say the least. Flipnote Hatena was, in a lot of ways, reminiscent of YouTube back in its early period, in that you were essentially watching a bunch of short, often low-quality videos stuffed with old meme references and lots of random XD humor. It was quite common to see references to things like Over 9000, Dr. Octagonopus, Ouija, Rage Comic Faces, and all sorts of other internet humor that hasn't been funny in over a decade. I mentioned before that Flipnotes could use audio from the DSi microphone. And while there were definitely creators who took advantage of this and wrote their own scripts and acted out their own audio, I'd say it was far more common for people to take audio from pre-existing media and just animate over it. For example, a really popular genre of Flipnote involved creators taking scenes from Family Guy and animating over them. The original Family Guy funny moments, if you will. There were also Flipnotes animating SpongeBob scenes, movie scenes, music videos, and perhaps most commonly of all, YouTube videos. Yeah, if a video went viral on YouTube, there was a high chance you'd run into an animated version of it on Flipnote Hatena. I remember animations of Smosh videos, ASDF movies, Annoying Orange, music video parodies, and so many others. Since I was an uncultured child who hadn't seen a lot of the source material behind these kind of Flipnotes, in my mind, these were all brand new creations made from the ground up, and I was very easily impressed that people managed to come up with this kind of stuff. Of course, looking back on it now, I recognize that like 90% of the Flipnotes I was watching was just animations of pre-existing media, most of which is horribly outdated now. Another popular genre of Flipnotes were lyric videos. Yeah, I wasn't lying when I said this service was just early YouTube. I didn't have an iPod or anything, so it was always a bit of a treat when I'd click on a Flipnote, and it was a shitty, low-res chunk of a pop song that I really liked back then. I remember ones for Gangnam Style, Call Me Maybe, Payphone, Lazy Song. Basically any pop song you can think of from that sort of like 2010 to 2012 era, it was on there. Somewhere. There were of course people who made fully original content too, some of which was actually pretty good. My favorite of these creators was Gizmo, who was one of the top users on the platform for a lot of its run. He made fully original sketch comedies with his own voice acting, and the animation was usually pretty tight and expressive too, despite being stick figure based. Looking back, these aren't anything that special, seeing as they were made by a literal child on the 2010 era internet, but since I and many other users were also just kids, his content resonated with a lot of us. Plenty of other original creators thrived on the platform as well, be it making comedy sketches like Gizmo, or just really impressive original animations like Boss and his iconic stick figure fight Flipnotes. There was of course a lesser remembered side of Flipnote too. You can't have an online service without some community drama. The biggest point of contention for many were star beggars, or people who just posted useless Flipnotes begging for stars. Stars were basically Flipnote's version of a like system, but the really strange catch was that you could give an unlimited number of them out. If you wanted to sit there and spam a video you really liked with stars until they hit 1 million, you were more than free to do so. While stars were mostly worthless, this didn't stop people from absolutely simping for them. And of course, the more vocal creators in the community would make rant Flipnotes, sort of complaining about these kinds of people. Yeah, sometimes Flipnotes weren't even animations, like people would just write things out and set the frame rate to be really slow. Some people even made traditional comics this way, which was another genre of Flipnote that I honestly really enjoyed. Content theft was, of course, another issue with the platform. I mentioned earlier that you could edit Flipnotes, but I didn't mention that you could download others. Some people would take other creators' Flipnotes, make extremely minor edits, and re-upload them as their own, and as you can imagine, this caused additional drama within the community. If you were tired of sifting through the popular page to find the good stuff, much like YouTube, you could visit a creator's page and see their whole library. And I remember with Gizmo in specific, I would constantly be checking his page to see if he had uploaded any new content. Unfortunately, towards the end of Flipnote Hatena's lifespan, I remember he had put out a Flipnote saying that he was going to be going on hiatus for a while and wasn't sure if he'd ever return. Since he he had left the door open to come back at some point, I remember for probably months I would check on his channel every now and then and see if he'd returned from his hiatus yet. Unfortunately, he never would, as Flipnote Hatena would soon be entering a bit of a hiatus of its own. Before that, however, we need to go back about 2 years. In early 2011, Nintendo released the 3DS, which not only was a replacement for the DSi, but an entirely new successor to the DS family altogether. The system was a huge success pretty much right out of the gate, and almost immediately Nintendo had begun secretly working on a follow-up to Flipnote Studios. There was a lot of hype in the Flipnote community at the time about what this could mean for the future of the service. People theorized how great a potential sequel to Flipnote on the 3DS could actually be. Maybe they'd add in some new colors and effects, maybe even some new brushes and pens. How naive we all were. Flipnote on the 3DS would, of course, happen, just not in the way we all thought. In spring of 2013, users logged on to Flipnote Hatena to see an important news memo that the servers would be shutting down for good effective May of that year. With only around 2 to 3 months to mentally prepare, the entire community pretty much went into panic mode. Users began uploading Flipnotes vocally protesting the shutdown, with plenty trying to contact Nintendo themselves to keep the service alive. Unfortunately, our pleas went unheard and unnoticed, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. The 3DS version of Flipnote, titled Flipnote 3D, was planned to launch in August of that year, and from the trailers it looked pretty great. It was the same Flipnote we all knew and loved, but with more tools, colors, options, and the ability to make 3D Flipnotes. On May 31st, 2013, shortly after graduating from my K-8 middle school, I and many others logged on to Flipnote Hatena for what would be the final time. For years, I had been logging on to Flipnote every single day after school, weekend mornings, summer nights. It was a comfort to me, a routine. If I was having a bad day, then logging into Flipnote to see what was trending always made me feel a little bit better. But it wouldn't be long until Flipnote 3D was in our hands and the community could reconvene in our new home. After all, August was only a few months away. Right? Well, August 2013 came and went, and Flipnote 3D never showed up. It definitely existed, of course, as in Japan, the application had already dropped earlier in July, but the word on the street was that its Western release had already been delayed due to the high demand of the online servers. Well, no big deal, right? Things get delayed all the time. We could wait a little bit longer. Week after week, I would constantly check Google for any news updates on the status of Flipnote 3D, but unfortunately, they never came. August turned to September, then October, then November, then December. We were completely left in the dark with 0 updates, and by the time 2014 rolled around, it seemed to be completely forgotten. Winter turned to spring, spring turned to summer, summer turned to fall, and fall turned back to winter. Going into 2015, it had been nearly 2 years since Flipnote Hatena initially closed its doors, and fans were still left in the dark with no new updates on the status of Flipnote 3D. Some of the more passionate users had moved on to create their own online servers for Flipnote Hatena, but considering the extra know-how needed to access such a thing, it lacked the same casual appeal. Meanwhile, in Japan, Flipnote 3D was already facing trouble, as while you could still upload your Flipnotes online, the new ability to share Flipnotes directly with friends was entirely revoked, due to lewd and inappropriate Flipnotes being sent around, a problem Nintendo also ran into with the system's SwapNote messaging application, but that's a story for a whole other video. It seemed like the Western plans for Flipnote 3D had been abandoned, and I had accepted that. I was in high school now. I had an iPhone with Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat on it. I was learning how to drive. I missed Flipnote dearly, but I had moved on. Then one day, out of seemingly nowhere, Nintendo announced that Flipnote 3D would finally be coming to the West as an exclusive, limited-time-only reward for Club Nintendo members. Oh, and also only in North America, so any other region, like say Europe or South America, were completely fucked. To add insult to injury, the online functionality present in the original Japanese release was entirely gutted, likely due to Nintendo's fear at the time of people sharing inappropriate creations. So after 2 years of waiting with the community entirely disrupted, the remaining fans were given a real slap in the face. If you weren't a Club Nintendo member like myself, then you were completely out of luck in getting Flipnote 3D. But even if you could get it, which to be fair, I'm sure a lot of people still were, you couldn't even share your creations online with anybody. At least to me, that defeats the entire purpose of Flipnote. Nobody wants to create for an audience of 0. All of the new bells and whistles in the world didn't really matter if your Flipnotes were just going to be sitting on your handheld system for nobody to see. Nintendo was 2 years too late, with a gate-kept release of an app with no online functionality. functionality. And to make matters worse, the rest of the world outside of Japan and North America still had to wait an entire year. That's right, most regions had to wait until the year of our Lord 2016 to get Flipnote 3D. And once again, it was a limited time only reward exclusive with no online functionality. I cannot stress enough how much Nintendo dropped the ball on this. They completely abandoned the Flipnote community, left us hanging in the dark for 2 to 3 years with no updates, then released a sequel with no online functionality only available to members of Club Nintendo. Unfortunately, this was the last time we would ever hear about Flipnote, as only a year later the Nintendo Switch would officially release, thus ending not only the DS family of systems, but an entire era where handheld gaming provided its own unique experience. For a while there were rumors here and there about a Flipnote application for the Switch, but they never came into fruition. Quite frankly, given the system's nature, I'm not sure it ever would have even worked, seeing as precision drawing even in handheld mode isn't really its strong suit. Hell, the Switch doesn't even have a stylus to draw with. It's now been nearly a decade since Flipnote Hatena originally shut down, and a lot has changed since then. It's sad to think that May 31st, 2013 was the last time I would ever log into my favorite online space. And I really wish we could have seen how the Flipnote community would have evolved with Flipnote 3D, like we were promised all of those years ago. I had mentioned that fans had created their own online servers for Flipnote Hatena, and that's actually still true to this day. It's called Sudo Memo, and with a few YouTube tutorials, you actually can reroute the Flipnote app on your DSi to it. Like I said, however, Flipnote was a lightning in a bottle moment in time, and unfortunately it's not the same experiencing it today. While there are still occasional new uploads, it's extremely inactive compared to a decade ago, and the novelty is long since worn off. Also, I'm not fucking 12 anymore. All things come to an end eventually, and those of us that grew up with Flipnote have all moved on to other online spaces. While I never got around to uploading my own Flipnotes, which realistically was for the best, I'm not an animator, here I am a decade later fulfilling my desire to create on YouTube. Flipnote Hatena will forever have had an impact on those who grew up with it, as well as the internet as a whole, and that's something that can never be taken away. Unlike Flipnote, which was brutally ripped out of our hands and murdered in front of us Old Yeller style.
No hope on the horizon, got a 2-year contract and I'm stuck on Verizon.
I got no iPhone. I got no iPhone. I got no